Justice had been served, or so they believed, but in the quiet corners of Westfield on the Green, whispers still lingered, whispers of a crime far more intricate than anyone dared to admit. Croft was in chains, Clarissa Penrose was free, and yet, beneath the surface of this seemingly resolved mystery, something remained, something unsaid, unseen, but not undone. Because the truth is never as simple as a confession, and some crimes never truly end. The train to Blackwood Hollow was a relic of a bygone era, its worn carriages humming with a rhythmic sway as they carved through the mist-laden countryside. Outside the window, the landscape unfurled in hushed eerie beauty, rolling hills shrouded in tendrils of fog, gnarled trees stretching their skeletal limbs toward an overcast sky, and lonely cottages with darkened windows that seemed to watch the train pass with silent expectancy. Here and there, a lone figure stood amid the fields, heads turning briefly before vanishing into the grey. Miss Eleanor Graves, composed and unhurried, observed it all with the trained eye of a woman who had long understood that the quietest places often harbored the deepest secrets. Adjusting her gloves with practiced elegance, she let her gaze drift across the nearly empty compartment, an elderly man muttering behind his newspaper, a young woman twisting her handkerchief with anxious fingers, and a gentleman who had not turned a page of his book in nearly 10 minutes. The air carried the scent of polished wood, and something less tangible, an anticipation, an unspoken tension. The conductor's voice rang through the carriage, announcing Blackwood Hollow as the next stop, and with it, a ripple of something imperceptible shifted among the passengers, a breath caught, a glance exchanged, a momentary stiffness in posture. It was enough for Miss Graves to know that Blackwood Hollow was not just another village lost to time. Stepping onto the platform, she was met with a sight that spoke of an era unwilling to fade, a station meticulously maintained, yet eerily still, flower beds bursting with color that seemed almost too vibrant against the gloom. The village itself stretched beyond, cobbled streets leading to a huddled assembly of Tudor-style buildings, their heavy timber beams bowing with age. A lone bell tolled in the distance, though no church steeple was visible. Miss Graves took in the quiet figures gathered at the station, an old woman with sharp eyes knitting with unnatural focus, a man with a stiff gait watching the tracks too intently, and a cluster of villagers speaking in hushed tones that ceased the moment she stepped forward. The presence of an outsider was noted but not welcomed. As she moved toward the station entrance, a woman of formidable stature and an unfortunate hat adorned with faded violets intercepted her. "Miss Graves, is it not?" Her voice carried the weight of unearned familiarity. "I am Mrs. Genevieve Henshaw. Oh, but of course you don't remember me. Years ago, at the Harrington Gala, you wore the most sensible gloves I recall." Miss Graves, who had worn many sensible gloves, merely inclined her head. "How very kind of you to meet me, Mrs. Henshaw." The woman beamed, looping an arm through Miss Graves with unsettling eagerness. "I simply could not allow you to arrive unaccompanied. Blackwood Hollow is a place of tradition, after all, a lovely village, though one must tread carefully, wouldn't you agree?" Her voice dropped, the words laced with veiled caution. "Not everything is as it seems." Miss Graves' lips twitched in quiet amusement. "It rarely is," she murmured. As they stepped onto the winding main street, the sensation of unseen eyes followed them. The air was thick, not with the scent of summer blooms but with something intangible, an expectation, an unspoken trepidation. A butcher's wife arranging loaves in her shop window stole a glance before turning away too swiftly. A boy on a bicycle hesitated, as if reconsidering his route before pedaling off with unnatural urgency. A pair of women at the milliner's shop lowered their voices just as Miss Graves and Mrs. Henshaw passed, though one name still reached her ears, Everett Langley. Miss Graves tucked it away, understanding the weight of a name spoken in secrecy. Mrs. Henshaw exhaled, her grip on Miss Graves' arm tightening for a fraction of a second. "Everett Langley," she said at last, voice quiet yet taut. "A name best left to whispers, though some would prefer to forget it entirely. Miss Graves merely adjusted her gloves. "Shall we take tea first?" she asked mildly. Mrs. Henshaw hesitated before nodding. "Yes," she said, her voice curiously unsteady. "Yes, perhaps that would be best." And with that, they disappeared into the heart of the village, the warmth of the sun doing little to thaw the chill that clung to Blackwood Hollow, a chill Miss Graves knew all too well. After all, every village had its ghosts. Some merely waited for the right moment to step into the light. An old but reliable train was making its way toward Westwood on Hollow, its aged yet sturdy carriages swaying gently, as if they were part of the landscape itself. Outside, the scenery was as peaceful as ever, lush green fields, neatly arranged hedgerows, and red brick cottages that seemed frozen in time, whispering stories of the past. Occasionally a lone figure stood in the fields, gazing at the train for a fleeting moment before returning to their work. Miss Eleanor Whitmore, with her composed demeanor, observed it all with quiet interest. A perfect English village, serene and dignified, but if life had taught Eleanor anything, it was that beneath every quiet facade, a secret was waiting to be uncovered. Adjusting her finely stitched gloves, she glanced around her compartment, a plump woman knitting furiously, as if racing against time, and a gentleman buried in his newspaper, turning each page with an air of mild irritation. The journey was smooth, yet there was a certain tension in the air, a whisper of something unspoken. "Westwood on Hollow, next stop," the conductor announced, but few paid attention, except for the knitting woman, who murmured something under her breath. Eleanor readied herself, gathering her bag with practiced ease. The station was a relic of another time. There was an eerie stillness to it, as though everything here had paused, waiting for something to happen. A young girl offered a small fleeting wave to a man on the platform, while an elderly gentleman, tapping his cane thoughtfully, seemed to be expecting someone who never arrived. No one here knew Eleanor, and that was precisely how she preferred it. People's true nature was best revealed when they believed no one was watching. As she stepped off the train, a striking woman with an air of authority, adorned with artificial roses and violets on an absurdly extravagant hat, approached her with open arms. "Miss Whitmore, oh, I do hope you remember me." Henrietta Langley had a way of making every encounter feel like a grand event. Eleanor offered a polite smile. "Of course, Mrs. Langley. A pleasure to see you." Henrietta clasped Eleanor's hand with a firm grip. "I couldn't possibly let you wander alone. Westwood is a fascinating place, but some things here are better left unsaid." As they walked through the village, Eleanor took everything in with her sharp, discerning gaze. A butcher's wife carefully arranging flowers on her windowsill, yet distracted, as if something weighed on her mind. A postman who always watched new arrivals with quiet curiosity, pausing as if about to speak, but thinking better of it. There was something missing here, an absence, a hesitation, a silence that spoke louder than words. Then, as they passed a group of women engaged in hushed conversation, Eleanor caught a name, a fragmented whisper, but enough to remember: Everett Hayworth. Henrietta flinched. "You've heard the name already." Eleanor merely offered a measured response. Names are always significant, but the silence surrounding them is even more telling. Henrietta exhaled, her grip tightening on her shawl. "He's dead, Eleanor." There was an unspoken weight in her words. Eleanor simply adjusted her gloves. "And yet no one here seems willing to talk about him." Henrietta took a careful sip of tea, lowering her voice. "They do talk, just enough to satisfy curiosity, but never the full truth. The rest is only speculation." Eleanor's voice was soft yet unwavering. "No man dies as a mere rumor." Henrietta's expression darkened. His wife Clarissa Hayworth, beautiful, intelligent, but not nearly as grief-stricken as one might expect. Eleanor considered this before asking, "And Dr. Lionel Morland?" Henrietta let out a wry chuckle. "Ah yes, the good doctor, well liked by everyone, perhaps too well liked by some, Eleanor took a thoughtful sip of tea before posing her next question. And what of Harriet Graves? Henrietta's lips pressed into a thin line. Harriet is a kind girl, respectable, but certain things were found in her cottage, things that raise questions. Eleanor's voice was calm, measured. No one is guilty simply because of what they own. Henrietta sighed. I need your help, Eleanor. This village feels as though it's trapped in a dream, but I fear the day is coming when something hidden will finally come to light. Eleanor pulled her gloves back on. Then perhaps it's time we find out exactly what that secret is. The grand hall of Everleigh Manor stood timeless beneath the glow of a dozen chandeliers, their golden light flickering against polished mahogany and age-darkened tapestries that whispered of generations past. Outside, the evening mist curled along the edges of the estate, weaving between the towering oaks like a silent spectre, pressing against the lidded glass windows as though eager to listen. Eleanor Whitmore stepped into the room with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime observing without being observed, her presence unassuming yet undeniably sharp. The gathering was small, tasteful, Westmere society at its most polished, but beneath the pleasantries, the air was thick with the kind of tension that did not come from mere social formalities. At the center of it all stood Edwin Ashworth, the master of Everleigh, a man whose name carried weight, and whose eyes carried burdens. He was speaking to his guests with measured politeness, though Eleanor noted the tightness at the corners of his mouth, the way his fingers drummed once, just once against the rim of his glass before stilling entirely. Across the room, his wife Celeste Ashworth stood by the marble fireplace, her posture effortlessly elegant, her gaze distant. Not the look of a grieving widow, nor that of a devoted wife. No, hers was the look of a woman calculating the weight of her own secrets. You see the way she holds her glass, murmured Beatrice Langley, standing just behind Eleanor's shoulder, not with ease, but with restraint. A woman aware that others are watching. Eleanor tilted her head ever so slightly. Or a woman with something to hide. The evening drifted on, a delicate waltz of veiled glances and guarded whispers, the soft clink of crystal, and the carefully measured laughter of those who had long learned to navigate conversations like a game of chess. Then the arrival of Dr. Vincent Crowley sent a ripple through the room. Tall, composed, exuding a quiet confidence, he carried himself with the air of a man who was either deeply trusted or profoundly dangerous. Edwin's gaze flickered toward him, just for a fraction of a second too long. I assume you weren't expecting me tonight, Doctor, Crowley murmured, his voice calm, but edged with something that set Eleanor's instincts on high alert. Edwin smiled, though it did not reach his eyes. No, but then again, surprises have been in abundance lately. The words hung there, fragile as glass, before the conversation resumed its careful dance. Eleanor stepped away, slipping onto the stone terrace, where the cool night air carried whispers of rose petals and secrets left unsaid, and then, voices. Low, deliberate. She stilled, blending into the shadows. You think I don't know, came Edwin's voice. Quiet but hard. You think I don't see what you're trying to do. A pause, then Dr. Crowley's reply, measured but laced with an undercurrent of something far sharper. I think you underestimate how much I already know. A beat of silence. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor, hidden, just beyond the ivy-clad wall, knew without a doubt, something was coming, something far more dangerous than whispered rumors or strained glances across a ballroom. And she intended to be there when it unraveled. The weight of midnight settled over the sprawling corridors of Ravenshade Manor, pressing into its ancient stones like a secret long kept. The last of the guests had departed, their laughter and pleasantries dissipating into the cool night air, leaving behind an uneasy hush. Eleanor Whitmore, ever an observer, had lingered just long enough to notice the stiffness in Lord Reginald Hawthorne's stride, as he retreated toward his study, the almost imperceptible tremor in Lady Vivian's hands as she bid her guests farewell. The great clock in the hall struck 12, its chimes echoing through the cavernous space, a reminder that some nights did not fade into peace, but sharpened into something altogether more sinister. Then a sound, sharp, unmistakable, a cry, raw with terror, puncturing the quiet like a blade through silk. Eleanor moved swiftly, her steps light against the marble as she followed the source toward the study. The heavy oak door left ajar, just enough to reveal flickering candlelight within. She pushed it open, the scent of old books and whiskey heavy in the air, and there, slumped in the grand leather armchair, was Lord Reginald himself, his posture eerily still, his mouth parted slightly, as though caught mid-sentence, except no words would ever come again. A jagged wound marred the pale skin of his throat, the ink-stained pages before him, now darkened with something far more final than spilled brandy. A gasp from the doorway, Lady Vivian stood frozen, one hand at her lips, her blue eyes wide and unblinking. "No," she whispered, barely more than a breath. Then from behind her the measured, deliberate footsteps of Dr. Nathaniel Graves. His usual air of unshakable composure had faltered just slightly, though his hands were steady as he crouched beside the body. A long silence stretched between them before he finally spoke. "He's dead." A tremor ran through Lady Vivian, though whether it was grief or something else entirely, Eleanor could not yet say. The others began to gather. Alexander Pierce, the solicitor, his gaze calculating even in shock, Miss Evelyn Wren, the governess, standing back with a carefully schooled expression, and Henry Caldwell, the house steward, his lips pressed into a thin, unreadable line. "Who found him?" Graves asked. "I." Lady Vivian hesitated. "I heard something. I came to see." Eleanor, unnoticed by most, watched her closely. Not her grief. Grief had its own language, but the way her fingers twisted at the lace of her sleeve, the way she did not look at her husband, but at the window beyond him, as though searching for something unseen. And then Eleanor saw it, the fine mist clinging to the study window, the faintest imprint of fingertips against the glass. Someone had been here, watching, listening, perhaps even waiting. Her gaze swept the room, catching small details the others missed. A half-open drawer, its contents disturbed. A brass letter opener, its blade clean, but resting at an odd angle atop a stack of documents, and there just beneath the edge of the rug, a single droplet of something dark, trailing toward the very window that bore those silent prints. The air in the room shifted, thickening with an unspoken weight. "Someone fetch the authorities," Graves ordered, rising to his feet, his gaze flickering toward Eleanor. "Miss Whitmore, this is unpleasant business." She smiled, cool and composed. "Oh, I expect it is, Doctor." And she did not move. The shrill wail of a constable's whistle split the night. Somewhere beyond the manor's gates, hidden in the shadows, someone else was waiting, watching, and Eleanor intended to find out who. The search had begun barely 20 minutes ago, yet already the grand parlor of Greystone Manor looked as though a tempest had torn through it. Drawers lay upended, their contents strewn across the Persian rug, like the discarded remains of some violent storm. The heavy oak wardrobe stood gaping open, its doors ajar as though in silent protest of the intrusion. Cushions were displaced, furniture nudged askew, and the cold fireplace bore the smudged fingerprints of those who had rifled through its ashes in desperate pursuit of something hidden, something damning. Near the doorway, Constable Whitaker hovered uncertainly, his youthful face pale with unease, his gaze flickering between the methodical destruction and the man orchestrating it. Sergeant Lionel Graves, broad-shouldered and brimming with an air of unshakable confidence, moved with purpose, directing his men with clipped efficiency. He was not a man given to hesitation. To Graves there were only facts, evidence, and inevitable conclusions. His eyes gleamed with the certainty of a predator that had already chosen its prey. Eleanor Radcliffe stood near the tall bay window, poised but silent, her gloved hands folded before her. She neither interfered nor removed herself from notice. She had long learned that silence could be the sharpest tool in a room full of noise. Across from her, at the dining table, Victoria Langley, small, sharp-eyed and rigid as a drawn bowstring, stood unmoving, her hands clenched at her sides. Her jaw was tight, her dark eyes burning with restrained fury, but when she spoke, her voice was measured, steady. "There's nothing to find," she said. Graves did not look up. "That remains to be seen, Miss Langley." A rustle, a sharp intake of breath. One of the constables straightened abruptly, emerging from the shadowed alcove beside the grand bed. In his gloved hand, he held a small knife, its blade modest, unremarkable, except for the initials VL etched into the handle. A murmur rippled through the room like the first tremor before an earthquake. The constable laid the knife upon the polished wooden table, placing it beside a bundle of fabric, a few loose threads of deep crimson navy, and charcoal, unmistakably from a tailor's shop. But it was the final discovery that made the air itself seem to contract. A letter, its edges yellowed with time, carefully unfolded and smoothed flat. Graves plucked it from the table and read aloud, "You believe yourself untouchable, but the past is not so easily buried. One day, the debt will be paid in full." A charged silence followed, thick and suffocating. Graves turned the letter toward Victoria. "This is in your handwriting." She stepped forward, pulse hammering visibly at her throat. "That's impossible," she said. "I never wrote that. It's addressed to Lord Everett." Graves' voice was almost indulgent, as though he were giving her the opportunity to explain the inevitable. He tapped the page lightly. "Would you care to explain why?" Her gaze flickered, ever so briefly, to the knife, then the ink-smudged corner of the letter, then to something unseen, something only she understood. A moment passed before she exhaled, slow and controlled. "No," she said, voice sharper now, "because it isn't mine." Graves lifted an eyebrow. "The knife has your initials. The letter speaks of revenge," and he paused, letting the weight of the moment settle upon her like an iron shackle. "You were noticeably absent when Lord Everett was last seen alive." Victoria's hands curled into fists. "I was in the conservatory." "Convenient," Graves murmured. "And yet, no one saw you there." "That doesn't mean I wasn't." Graves folded his arms, letting the silence stretch, tightening the noose inch by inch. The atmosphere had shifted. What had once been tense was now unbearable. The room, its grand chandeliers and regal furnishings, now felt like the walls of a cage. Victoria took a slow step back, her throat constricting, the gravity of the moment pressing down upon her. Her breath came faster, uneven. Then, suddenly, she turned, not to Graves, nor to the constables, but to Eleanor, the only one who had yet to look at her like she was already guilty. "You don't believe this, do you?" Eleanor adjusted the cuff of her glove, her expression unreadable. "Belief is a dangerous thing, Miss Langley," she murmured, her gaze drifting away from the evidence and toward something else entirely. Graves' notebook. His pencil moved swiftly, but Eleanor saw it. The way each letter was too precise, too measured, as though written with deliberate care. She had seen his handwriting before. This was not quite the same, and neither, she suspected, was the letter. Something was wrong. The evidence, the timing, the way it had all come together too cleanly. It did not feel like an investigation. It felt like a story being carefully written. A narrative sculpted before the truth had even been fully uncovered. This was not a case. This was a performance. And performances, Eleanor knew, were always staged for an audience. The question was, who had written the script? Beyond the heavy curtains, the rain began to fall, soft at first, then insistent, drumming against the window panes like a restless hand tapping for attention. Somewhere in the unseen shadows beyond the manor walls, the real story lurked, waiting to be found, and Eleanor intended to find it. Victoria Langley sat rigid in the straight-backed wooden chair, her fingers clenching and unclenching in her lap. The tear tracks on her face had dried, but her expression held the haunted look of someone trying to piece together the fragments of a reality that had suddenly collapsed around them. Across from her, Sergeant Lionel Graves reclined in his chair, arms crossed, eyes hooded, with the air of a man who had already decided the outcome of this interrogation. The candlelight flickered against the dark wood of the constabulary office, making the polished desk between them gleam. A penknife lay at its center, its blade catching the glow, a modest thing, unassuming save for the initials VL carefully etched into its handle. Graves exhaled through his nose, a slow measured sound. "A weapon bearing your initials," he intoned, "found in your home, tucked away as though waiting to be discovered." Victoria's throat bobbed. "I told you, I don't own that knife." Graves ignored the protest, and instead unfolded the aged creased letter beside it, letting the paper settle with a deliberate whisper of sound. He read, voice smooth, unhurried, "You believe yourself untouchable, but the past is not so easily buried. One day the debt will be paid in full." His eyes lifted to meet hers. "Not your handwriting either, I suppose?" Victoria barely looked at the note before shaking her head, her voice sharp. "No, it isn't." Graves made a noise of mild skepticism, perhaps written in anger, a moment of bitterness you've conveniently forgotten. Victoria's jaw tightened. "I don't forget things like that." Graves studied her, and for a fleeting moment, something unreadable passed behind his gaze. Then, with a smirk just shy of amusement, he leaned back. "Interesting," he mused. "Considering that two separate witnesses claim you had an argument with Lord Everett days before his murder." Victoria blinked, startled. "That's a lie. I never argued with him." "Then why would they say otherwise?" Graves tilted his head, as if he already knew the answer. Silence. The air in the room had thickened, pressing inward like the tightening coils of a trap. The only sound was the rhythmic clicking of knitting needles. Jane Weatherby's, seated in the far corner, her expression mild, her posture unassuming. But her eyes missed nothing. "Sergeant," she interjected at last, her voice pleasant but firm, "if I may." Graves turned slightly, as though just remembering her presence. "Yes, Miss Weatherby." She offered a gentle smile. "I am an old woman and my memory is perhaps not what it once was, but I believe I heard Mr. Ambrose Langley mention that Victoria was at his shop during the time of Lord Everett's death. Am I mistaken?" Graves hesitated. Across the desk, Victoria sat forward, a flicker of desperate hope in her eyes. "Yes," she said quickly. "I was helping my uncle. I delivered a tailored coat to the magistrate's estate myself. If you ask the housekeeper, she'll tell you. I knocked on the door, spoke with her, handed her the package." A pause. Graves cleared his throat, but Weatherby caught the faintest shift in his expression. A flicker of doubt, small but there. He masked it quickly. "I'll look into it," he said, voice carefully neutral. "I'm sure you will," Weatherby murmured, her knitting never faltering. The door swung open just then, allowing a breath of cool night air to slip into the room. Alistair Reed stepped inside, peeling off his gloves with the slow, deliberate grace of a man accustomed to control. There was something calculating in the way his gaze flickered from Graves to Victoria, as if he were mentally measuring each of them against some unseen scale. "Sergeant," he greeted smoothly. "Do you require anything further from me?" Graves shook his head. "Your statement was thorough." Dr. Reed nodded in satisfaction, then turned his attention to Victoria. "Miss Langley," he said, his voice steeped in an air of practiced sympathy, "this is all very unfortunate." Victoria didn't respond, but Weatherby noted the doctor's choice of words. "Not unfair, not unjust, just unfortunate." A subtle distinction, a deliberate one. Dr. Reed turned back to Graves. "I trust you're exploring all angles of this case, Sergeant." Graves frowned slightly, meaning. Reed gave a small reluctant sigh, as though hesitant to voice what was already decided in his mind. "Her uncle," he said finally, "Ambrose Langley. The man is drowning in debt, is he not? He would have had access to Lord Everett's study. He fitted the man's suits after all." Victoria's head snapped up. "My uncle had nothing to do with this." Reed lifted a placating hand. "I mean no harm, Miss Langley, but facts must be considered, mustn't they?" Weatherby's knitting slowed, her sharp gaze lingering on the doctor's composed features. He was deflecting, redirecting, pushing suspicion elsewhere just as the weight of it had begun settling on Victoria. An opportunist, seizing the moment, she tapped her needles together lightly, thoughtfully. Something in this room was very wrong. Outside, the village clock chimed the hour. Beyond the constabulary's small windows, the streets lay dark and quiet, rain pooling in the cobblestones. Somewhere in those unseen shadows, the real truth lurked, and Jane Weatherby intended to find it. Earl's Hollow Tea House, bathed in the muted amber glow of the late afternoon sun, hummed with the quiet murmur of conversation. China cups clinked gently against saucers, delicate wisps of steam curling into the air, carrying the scent of bergamot and warm scones. The lace-draped tables, the silver-plated sugar tongs, the gentle creak of the wooden floor, it all painted a scene of tranquil civility. But to Miss Eleanor Whitmore, this was no simple afternoon gathering. Beneath the delicate pretense of gossip and idle chatter, the village's darkest secrets were unspooling, thread by thread. Seated by the window, Miss Whitmore appeared nothing more than an elderly woman indulging in her tea, her silver hair pinned neatly beneath a soft lavender hat, her gloved fingers resting lightly on the rim of her cup. But her sharp blue eyes, ever watchful, skimmed across the room, catching the flicker of nervous glances, the tension lurking beneath hushed conversations. "Dreadful business," murmured Mrs. Tillingham, the baker's wife, leaning in conspiratorially toward her companion, Mrs. Harcourt. "To be strangled in his own study, and did you hear? His ledger is missing." Mrs. Harcourt gasped into her cup. "You don't mean the accounts?" Mrs. Tillingham nodded gravely. "Every shilling unaccounted for, and if you ask me, there's only one person who'd benefit from that." Miss Whitmore's fingers stilled on her saucer. Across the room, a pair of tailors from Baxter and Company bent over their tea, their voices low and guarded. Harold Langley owed the poor man a fortune, one muttered, more than he could ever hope to pay. "And yet," the other replied, stirring his tea thoughtfully, "I saw Langley in the Red Fox just last week, paying for drinks with crisp new notes. Strange, don't you think?" Miss Whitmore did think, and she thought even more when moments later, a shadow flickered at her table. She turned to find a young girl no older than 13, hovering nervously beside her, eyes darting around the room as if afraid of being overheard. "Miss Whitmore," the girl whispered, "I wasn't sure if I should tell, but I saw Constable Reed coming out of Mr. Langley's study, late at night. Before the police found anything." Miss Whitmore's grip on her teaspoon tightened ever so slightly. "Are you quite certain, dear?" The girl nodded, her small hands twisting in the folds of her dress. And he looked worried. A silence settled over Miss Whitmore's thoughts. The constable. Why would an officer of the law be sneaking into a suspect's study in the dead of night? Unless, of course, the evidence had been planted long before it was ever found. Across the village in the dim-lit confines of Langley's tailor shop, Harold Langley sat behind his counter, his knuckles white against the polished wood. His eyes darted toward the closed door, as though expecting someone to barge in at any moment. "I swear it," he said, voice hoarse. "Whatever they found in my office, it wasn't mine." Miss Whitmore eyed him carefully, then reached into her purse, withdrawing a small, unassuming ledger. Langley's breath hitched. "Where did your assistant," she replied smoothly. He was quite eager to be rid of it. Langley's jaw clenched. "It's forged. Someone wants me to take the fall." Miss Whitmore turned a page, tapping a particular entry with her gloved finger. "A curious thing," she mused. A sum paid out on the very night of Mr. Hawthorne's murder. To whom I wonder, Langley exhaled sharply. You think I'd kill him over a debt? No, but someone wanted me to look guilty. The door creaked open, and Constable Reed stepped in. He hesitated when he saw the ledger in Miss Whitmore's hands. His fingers twitched at his side. The hesitation was brief, but Miss Whitmore caught it. She looked up, her sharp blue eyes locking onto his. Tell me, Constable, she said pleasantly, how long have you been in Mr. Hawthorne's pocket? A single bead of sweat rolled down Reed's temple, and in that fleeting moment, Miss Whitmore knew someone had orchestrated this entire case with meticulous precision, and the real murderer was watching. The dim glow of the gaslights flickered against the damp cobblestones of Ashford Green, where the crisp night air carried whispers of scandal and secrecy. Inside the Bluebell Inn, a modest establishment favored by travelers and locals alike, Miss Eleanor Whitmore sat quietly in the shadowed corner of the room, the rim of her porcelain teacup brushing her lips as she listened intently. The crackling fireplace cast long, wavering silhouettes against the wooden-paneled walls, and at a far table, hunched over a half-empty tumbler of brandy, sat Sergeant Wallace Hartley. His thick fingers drummed absent-mindedly against the table, his eyes darting across the room with the watchfulness of a man who knew he was being watched. Just a few hours ago, the village had been shaken by the discovery of Nathaniel Forsyth's lifeless body in his study, a blood-stained letter opener driven deep into his chest. The tragedy alone was enough to send ripples of unease through Ashford Green, but what unsettled Miss Whitmore most was the conveniently placed evidence, a handkerchief embroidered with the initials H.L., belonging to none other than Harriet Langford, the late gentleman's former housekeeper. Too convenient, too precise. Miss Whitmore had spent a lifetime observing human nature, and if there was one thing she knew, it was that real crimes were rarely so neat. Reckon it's all but settled, muttered a voice at a nearby table. Miss Whitmore did not need to turn her head to recognize the thick accent of Henry Mortimer, the village postmaster. Poor girl's as good as hanged, ain't she? That's the trouble, isn't it? Replied James Pell, the innkeeper. It's too open and shut. Miss Langford never had reason to harm Mr. Forsyth, but debts now, that's another matter. A flicker of interest passed through Miss Whitmore's mind. Debts, Pell continued, lowering his voice. Forsyth had money troubles. Gambling, I heard, and someone had him in their pocket. Might be the reason someone wanted him dead. At the far end of the room, Sergeant Hartley shifted uncomfortably, as though the conversation had struck a nerve. Miss Whitmore's fingers tightened around the delicate handle of her teacup. The village constabulary, a small and cluttered space filled with dusty ledgers and rusting typewriters, had yielded its own secrets earlier that afternoon. A cursory glance at Forsyth's financial records had revealed irregularities, sums withdrawn, debts left unpaid, names written and hastily scratched out. And then there was the matter of the forged report. Miss Whitmore had seen enough handwriting in her lifetime to know when a signature had been forged, and the document that placed Harriet Langford at the scene of the crime had been altered. Convenient, she had murmured to herself at the time. Now as she watched Hartley down the remainder of his brandy in a single gulp, the pieces were beginning to align. He had been eager, too eager, to push blame onto Harriet. But why? To protect himself, or someone else? Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft voice. Miss Whitmore. She turned to see a nervous figure, a boy of barely 12, his cap pulled low over his brow, fidgeting with the frayed cuffs of his sleeves. "What is it, dear?" she asked gently. The boy swallowed hard. I saw Sergeant Hartley outside Mr. Forsyth's house, late at night, before anyone found the body." Miss Whitmore's heart gave a single measured beat. "And what was he doing?" The boy hesitated. "Burying something." In the garden behind the study window, a slow smile, one of quiet satisfaction, crept across Miss Whitmore's lips. She set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Thank you, my dear. You've been most helpful." The pieces had been scattered across the board, but now they were falling into place. Harriet Langford was innocent. The real question remained: just how far was Sergeant Hartley willing to go to keep his secrets buried? The night was thick with mist as Miss Eleanor Whitmore stepped into the Bluebell Inn, her presence almost ghost-like in the dimly lit space. Near the fireplace, hunched over a tumbler of whiskey, sat Inspector Thomas Garvey, his pallid face drawn with tension. His fingers tapped absently against the rim of his glass, his lips moving in a low, urgent murmur as he spoke into the battered telephone mounted on the wall. Miss Whitmore had not meant to overhear, but she did. "I told you I handled it," Garvey hissed, his voice tight with restrained fury. A pause. The muffled reply from the other end was too soft to discern, but whatever was said made his grip tighten around the receiver. "I'll keep my mouth shut for now, but if this goes any further," his voice wavered slightly, then sharpened, "you won't just have me to worry about." Miss Whitmore stirred her tea, her expression betraying nothing but beneath her calm exterior, her mind moved like a sharpened blade. The call ended abruptly. Garvey exhaled, staring blankly into his drink before standing, only to turn and nearly collide with her. "Oh dear," she said pleasantly, tilting her head in feigned surprise. "What a coincidence." Garvey's entire body stiffened. "Miss Whitmore," he acknowledged, forcing a tight-lipped smile, "I didn't see you there." "Few people ever do," she murmured, observing him with keen interest. Garvey was a man known for his composure, but tonight his movements were sharp, unsteady. Something had rattled him. "Something I can help you with?" he asked, his voice forcibly light. "Perhaps," she mused, her eyes never leaving his. "You see, I happened upon some rather curious information today about official reports, about how one might adjust a document if one were so inclined." A muscle in Garvey's jaw twitched. "That's absurd, is it?" she countered mildly. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Then in a too hasty motion, Garvey grabbed his coat.
"It's late, Miss Whitmore.
"You should go home. A good night's rest can be very revealing, Inspector," she said softly. For a split second something flickered in his eyes. Fear. Then without another word, he strode past her, and out into the cold night. Miss Whitmore did not move. She had seen that kind of retreat before, not the guilt of a man caught in his lies, but the panic of one who had been backed into a corner. And cornered men were dangerous. Dawn had barely begun to break when a sharp knock sounded against her cottage door. Mrs. Henrietta Bradshaw, a woman rarely prone to hysteria, stood breathless on the threshold, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders. "Eleanor," she gasped. "It's terrible. Inspector Garvey, he's dead." Miss Whitmore's fingers stilled around the rim of her teacup. "Dead?" she repeated, her voice mild. "His motor car," Henrietta choked out, "overturned on Millbank Road. They say he lost control in the dark. The constable's already there." Miss Whitmore reached for her coat. "Yes," she murmured. "Treacherous indeed." Millbank Road was a winding narrow stretch that twisted through thick woodlands, its steep embankments notorious for sending careless drivers into the ravine below. Garvey's motor car lay crumpled against an ancient oak, the front smashed, one headlamp still flickering weakly. The morning mist curled around the wreckage, eerie and silent. Constable Henry Lane stood nearby, his face grim as he spoke with Dr. Edwin Blunt.
The doctor straightened
as Miss Whitmore approached. "Terrible business," he muttered, nodding toward the wreckage. "Lost control most likely. The road's treacherous in the mornings." Miss Whitmore peered through the shattered driver's window. A thin smear of dried blood traced from his temple, though the wound was small, too small to explain his death. She glanced at the road. The conditions were slick. Yes, but Garvey had been an experienced driver, cautious by nature. Something felt wrong. Then she saw it. Near the front wheel, beneath the chassis, faint but deliberate, were fresh scratches on the brake line. Her expression did not change. but her heartbeat quickened. Someone had ensured Garvey would never speak again. The morning fog clung to the village like a whispered secret, as Miss Eleanor Whitmore knelt beside the wreckage of Inspector Garvey's motorcar, her fingers ghosting over the twisted frame. Near the front wheel, just beneath the chassis, she saw it, thin deliberate scratches on the brake line, subtle enough to escape casual notice, but undeniable to an observant eye. She straightened, turning to Dr. Edwin Blake, who stood nearby, arms crossed over his thick woolen coat. "Doctor, would you say the late inspector was in excellent health?" she inquired, her voice mild but probing. Blake frowned at the odd question. "No known ailments, if that's what you mean," he said cautiously. "No signs of illness last night." A hesitation. "None that I saw." Miss Whitmore smiled faintly. Someone had ensured that Garvey never spoke again, and they had made it look like an accident. She turned to Constable Henry Lane, whose face had paled slightly at the implication. "Constable, I believe we ought to examine the body more closely. There may be something we've overlooked." Lane swallowed hard but gave a terse nod. Miss Whitmore stepped back, her mind already dissecting the layers of deception at play. The news of Garvey's death spread like a winter draft through the cobbled streets of Ashford Hollow, rustling through the quiet tea-houses and dim-lit bookshops. By midday, hushed conversations had turned to frantic speculation. Panic was not the village's way, but neither was a series of untimely deaths. As Miss Whitmore strolled past the Queen's Arms, she noted subtle shifts in behavior. The usual murmurs of gossip were now exchanged in hurried whispers, glances were cast over shoulders, and a few shopkeepers had pulled down their shutters before dusk. Even Mrs. Winifred Hawthorne, who had never been known to rush a conversation, kept her head lowered as she passed the butcher's. The village had stiffened, as if waiting for the next shadow to fall. Then there was Celia Marchant, widow of Edmund Marchant. In the days following her husband's mysterious demise, she had remained composed, her grief measured, her interactions brief but polite. Now she had vanished from public view entirely. Over tea that afternoon, Mrs. Harriet Davies, the village's self-appointed purveyor of information, confirmed it with an indignant sniff. "She shut herself away in that great cold house of hers. Even the staff have been dismissed. Well, most of them. Only the housekeeper remains." Miss Whitmore raised an eyebrow. A sudden change of heart, or self-preservation. Harriet pursed her lips. "She was never sentimental. I imagine she's considering what becomes of a widow of means when two men have now died under such unfortunate circumstances." Miss Whitmore's teaspoon clinked softly against her saucer. Two deaths, one expected, the other inconvenient. Harriet Montrose, the tailor's daughter, had been all but condemned for Edmund's death, yet now the man most eager to see her imprisoned lay dead in a ditch. Miss Whitmore had lived long enough to know that coincidences were a rarity. That evening, she sat in the dim glow of her study lamp, assembling her private collection of seemingly disparate details: a dead man, a panicked widow, a frightened girl, a doctor with an ambiguous past. And now she had something new. Constable Lane, still unnerved by the discovery of Garvey's tampered brake line, had permitted Miss Whitmore a few discreet moments with the inspector's personal effects. Among them, she found his gloves, stiff with dried mud, but at the fingertips, barely perceptible, were flecks of metal. She turned them over, feeling the faint residue between her fingers. She had seen this before, not on the hands of policemen, but on mechanics. And there was only one man in the village known for his mechanical hobbies, Dr. Lionel Rhodes. There was more. A folded receipt, hastily crumpled and shoved into Garvey's coat pocket, revealed a large cash withdrawal, dated 2 nights before his death. Miss Whitmore pursed her lips. A desperate man, on borrowed time. Had Garvey been paid off, or worse, had he attempted to buy his own safety? She leaned back in her chair, one finger tracing idle patterns against the wooden armrest. Edmund Marchant had been killed for a reason. Garvey had been killed for knowing too much. And somewhere in the margins, Lionel Rhodes had slipped under everyone's notice. Miss Whitmore allowed herself a small knowing smile. That would not last much longer. Miss Eleanor Whitmore entered the Ashford Hollow Library, with her usual unassuming air, pausing just long enough to admire the orderly rows of books. It was an old habit, one that disarmed people. The less threatening she appeared, the more they revealed. Behind the counter, Miss Beatrice Wren, the librarian, glanced up from her desk, a thin bird-like woman with permanently pursed lips. Beatrice had a way of folding her hands tightly, as if bracing herself for bad news. "Miss Whitmore," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "My dear, I was hoping for your assistance," Eleanor said kindly, approaching the desk. Beatrice hesitated, her fingers twitching against her skirt, gave a tight nod, and led her to a back table, far from prying ears. With careful hands, she retrieved a stack of old newspaper clippings, their edges yellowed and brittle with time. "These are from 4 years ago," she murmured, setting them down with reverence. "About the Morton Bennett Fund." Eleanor adjusted her spectacles, scanning the headlines with sharp intent. "A revolutionary initiative by Morton and Rhodes. Another Morton Rhodes Research Fund faces unforeseen delays, and then a peculiar one. Financial discrepancies cast doubt on medical venture." Her fingers tapped lightly over a paragraph. "An undisclosed sum believed to be in the thousands remains unaccounted for. Dr. Lionel Rhodes assures investors the matter is being handled." Eleanor's lips pressed together. "Handled," she mused. "How?" She turned to Beatrice. "Did you know Mr. Morton well?" The librarian hesitated, twisting a loose thread at her sleeve. "No," she murmured. "But I heard things." Eleanor leaned in slightly, her expression gentle but expectant. "What sorts of things, dear?" Beatrice's eyes flicked toward the door before she spoke. "That night when Mr. Morton died, I was walking past the manor." Eleanor's knitting needles clicked softly as she listened. "I heard voices," Beatrice whispered. "Raised voices." Eleanor kept her expression neutral. "And what did they say?" Beatrice swallowed hard. "I heard someone shout the word embezzlement. And then there was silence." Eleanor folded her hands, her mind already fitting the pieces together. It seemed Mr. Morton's financial troubles had caught up with him, and perhaps Dr. Rhodes had ensured they would never be spoken of again. Dr. Lionel Rhodes' surgery sat at the edge of the village, a modest yet immaculately maintained building. The brass nameplate gleamed from daily polishing. Appearances mattered to men like Rhodes. Eleanor rapped lightly at the door, and a moment later he appeared, his smile courteous but controlled. "Miss Whitmore," he said smoothly. "A pleasure. What brings you?" She returned his smile. "I'm afraid I've been feeling rather run down." Rhodes's expression remained pleasant, but something in his eyes flickered. "Of course," he said, stepping aside. "Do come in." The surgery was meticulously kept, polished instruments, neatly arranged files, and a lingering scent of antiseptic. Eleanor sat primly as Rhodes took her wrist, counting her pulse. "Any trouble sleeping?" he inquired. "Oh, I sleep quite well," Eleanor said pleasantly, "though I imagine poor Mr. Morton didn't." Toward the end, Rhodes' fingers hesitated, barely but enough. "A terrible loss," he said smoothly. "Did he suffer from any ailments?" His grip on her wrist tightened ever so slightly. "None of note." Eleanor tilted her head. "Oh, but I heard he was being prescribed something." "A sedative, was it?" The silence that followed was sharp. Then Rhodes exhaled a quiet, practiced laugh. "You must have heard wrong. A man like Charles wouldn't need such things." Eleanor said nothing, merely watched. And for the first time Rhodes looked away. He stood abruptly, moving to his desk. "If you'd like, I can recommend something for your fatigue." Eleanor folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Dr. Rhodes," she said mildly, "what do you suppose happens when a man discovers he has been swindled?" Rhodes' hand, reaching for a drawer handle, stilled mid-motion. "Miss Whitmore," he said, voice carefully measured, "are you accusing me of something?" She smiled serenely. "I've accused no one, dear. Though I do wonder, when debts are high, people sometimes act rashly." His face had gone tight, the polished civility of his demeanor slipping ever so slightly. "I should hope you choose your words carefully, madam." "Oh, always," she assured him, standing. "Words are rather important, don't you think?" As she turned, her eyes drifted past the open surgery door, toward a side room where a neatly arranged workbench stood against the wall. A collection of fine tools, gears and precision instruments lay in careful order, far too meticulous to be a simple pastime. Rhodes followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You enjoy mechanical work, Doctor?" He nodded once, slow and deliberate. "A hobby," he said. Eleanor smiled as she stepped toward the door. "How very interesting." Miss Eleanor Whitmore's eyes lingered on a delicate set of precision tools laid out in a meticulous row on Dr. Lionel Rhodes' workbench, small sharp instruments, perfect for adjusting delicate machinery, or perhaps a vehicle's brake lines. She glanced back at him, her expression mild but knowing. "I imagine you do," she murmured, then turned, stepping out into the crisp afternoon air. Behind her Rhodes watched, his jaw clenched, his fingers twitching at his side. Eleanor had what she needed. Now all that remained was to set the trap. Mrs. Rosalind Templeton's parlor was a picture of warmth and refinement, filled with the gentle chime of fine porcelain teacups and the rich aroma of buttered scones. The velvet drapes softened the daylight, but despite the cozy setting, there was an unmistakable tautness in the air, an invisible thread of tension pulling each occupant toward the edge of their composure. Eleanor Whitmore sat at the head of the table, her knitting resting idly in her lap. Around her sat the players in the drama she had so carefully unraveled. Dr. Lionel Rhodes, composed but stiff, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against his knee. Evelyn Morton, widow of the deceased, her back straight, her hands carefully folded in her lap, her expression impassive, yet her eyes betraying wariness. Young Charlotte Gray, pale but resolute, her father Thomas Gray, a tailor by trade, resting a protective hand on her shoulder, his face drawn with the exhaustion of weeks spent under suspicion, and finally Miss Adelaide Pruitt, the librarian, as small and silent as a bird caught in a snare. At the far end of the table, Mrs. Templeton, ever the gracious host, poured tea with an unspoken understanding that no one would dare drink it. Eleanor adjusted her spectacles, offering a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "I do appreciate you all coming," she said, her tone light yet deliberate. No one spoke. She let the silence stretch, then with a gentle sigh, folded her hands. "Now," she said, as if discussing a particularly intricate tapestry, "let us talk of murder." A shiver rippled through the room. The fire crackled in the hearth, but no one moved to warm their hands. Eleanor's voice remained even, as though she were merely recounting the details of a well-worn fable. "It began, of course, with the unfortunate demise of Charles Morton, a man of influence, yes, but also a man of secrets. Found dead in his study, slumped over his desk, his widow the first to discover him, and yet," she tilted her head slightly, "I suspect grief. Financial discrepancies cast doubt on medical venture." Her fingers tapped lightly over a paragraph. "An undisclosed sum believed to be in the thousands remains unaccounted for. Dr. Lionel Rhodes assures investors the matter is being handled." Eleanor's lips pressed together. "Handled," she mused. "How?" She turned to Beatrice. "Did you know Mr. Morton well?" The librarian hesitated, twisting a loose thread at her sleeve. "No," she murmured. "But I heard things." Eleanor leaned in slightly, her expression gentle but expectant. "What sorts of things, dear?" Beatrice's eyes flicked toward the door before she spoke. "That night when Mr. Morton died, I was walking past the manor. Eleanor's knitting needles clicked softly as she listened. I heard voices, Beatrice whispered. Raised voices. Eleanor kept her expression neutral. And what did they say? Beatrice swallowed hard. I heard someone shout the word embezzlement. And then there was silence. Eleanor folded her hands, her mind already fitting the pieces together. It seemed Mr. Morton's financial troubles had caught up with him, and perhaps Dr. Rhodes had ensured they would never be spoken of again. Dr. Lionel Rhodes' surgery sat at the edge of the village, a modest yet immaculately maintained building. The brass nameplate gleamed from daily polishing. Appearances mattered to men like Rhodes. Eleanor rapped lightly at the door, and a moment later he appeared, his smile courteous but controlled. "Miss Whitmore," he said smoothly. "A pleasure. What brings you?" She returned his smile. "I'm afraid I've been feeling rather run down." Rhodes's expression remained pleasant, but something in his eyes flickered. "Of course," he said, stepping aside. "Do come in." The surgery was meticulously kept, polished instruments, neatly arranged files, and a lingering scent of antiseptic. Eleanor sat primly as Rhodes took her wrist, counting her pulse. "Any trouble sleeping?" he inquired. "Oh, I sleep quite well," Eleanor said pleasantly, "though I imagine poor Mr. Morton didn't." Toward the end, Rhodes' fingers hesitated, barely but enough. "A terrible loss," he said smoothly. "Did he suffer from any ailments?" His grip on her wrist tightened ever so slightly. "None of note." Eleanor tilted her head. "Oh, but I heard he was being prescribed something." "A sedative, was it?" The silence that followed was sharp. Then Rhodes exhaled a quiet, practiced laugh. "You must have heard wrong. A man like Charles wouldn't need such things." Eleanor said nothing, merely watched. And for the first time Rhodes looked away. He stood abruptly, moving to his desk. "If you'd like, I can recommend something for your fatigue." Eleanor folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Dr. Rhodes," she said mildly, "what do you suppose happens when a man discovers he has been swindled?" Rhodes' hand, reaching for a drawer handle, stilled mid-motion. "Miss Whitmore," he said, voice carefully measured, "are you accusing me of something?" She smiled serenely. "I've accused no one, dear. Though I do wonder, when debts are high, people sometimes act rashly." His face had gone tight, the polished civility of his demeanor slipping ever so slightly. "I should hope you choose your words carefully, madam." "Oh, always," she assured him, standing. "Words are rather important, don't you think?" As she turned, her eyes drifted past the open surgery door, toward a side room where a neatly arranged workbench stood against the wall. A collection of fine tools, gears and precision instruments lay in careful order, far too meticulous to be a simple pastime. Rhodes followed her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You enjoy mechanical work, doctor?" He nodded once, slow and deliberate. "A hobby," he said. Eleanor smiled as she stepped toward the door. "How very interesting." Miss Eleanor Whitmore's eyes lingered on a delicate set of precision tools laid out in a meticulous row on Dr. Lionel Rhodes' workbench, small sharp instruments, perfect for adjusting delicate machinery, or perhaps a vehicle's brake lines. She glanced back at him, her expression mild but knowing. "I imagine you do," she murmured, then turned, stepping out into the crisp afternoon air. Behind her Rhodes watched, his jaw clenched, his fingers twitching at his side. Eleanor had what she needed. Now all that remained was to set the trap. Mrs. Rosalind Templeton's parlor was a picture of warmth and refinement, filled with the gentle chime of fine porcelain teacups and the rich aroma of buttered scones. The velvet drapes softened the daylight, but despite the cozy setting, there was an unmistakable tautness in the air, an invisible thread of tension pulling each occupant toward the edge of their composure. Eleanor Whitmore sat at the head of the table, her knitting resting idly in her lap. Around her sat the players in the drama she had so carefully unraveled. Dr. Lionel Rhodes, composed but stiff, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against his knee. Evelyn Morton, widow of the deceased, her back straight, her hands carefully folded in her lap, her expression impassive, yet her eyes betraying wariness. Young Charlotte Gray, pale but resolute, her father Thomas Gray, a tailor by trade, resting a protective hand on her shoulder, his face drawn with the exhaustion of weeks spent under suspicion, and finally Miss Adelaide Pruitt, the librarian, as small and silent as a bird caught in a snare. At the far end of the table, Mrs. Templeton, ever the gracious host, poured tea with an unspoken understanding that no one would dare drink it. Eleanor adjusted her spectacles, offering a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "I do appreciate you all coming," she said, her tone light yet deliberate. No one spoke. She let the silence stretch, then with a gentle sigh, folded her hands. "Now," she said, as if discussing a particularly intricate tapestry, "let us talk of murder." A shiver rippled through the room. The fire crackled in the hearth, but no one moved to warm their hands. Eleanor's voice remained even, as though she were merely recounting the details of a well-worn fable. "It began, of course, with the unfortunate demise of Charles Morton, a man of influence, yes, but also a man of secrets. Found dead in his study, slumped over his desk, his widow the first to discover him, and yet," she tilted her head slightly, "I suspect grief. The ledger, the missing sum, the threats Mr. Vaughan had received, it all pointed to something much darker than mere misfortune. He was silenced before he could expose a secret, a betrayal that ran closer than he had realized. And when young Joseph Blake unknowingly stumbled upon the loose thread, well, she let her gaze linger on Rupert. It had to be cut before the entire tapestry unraveled. A flicker of something passed over Rupert's face, resentment, fear, resignation. Evelyn exhaled softly. But a clever man always leaves a mark, and Dr. Moore, her gaze turned to the physician, who sat motionless, his hands now clasped tightly together. "You of all people should know how difficult it is to forge a death certificate without the smallest inconsistency." A murmur rippled through the room. Dr. Moore's lips parted, as though forming a protest, but he said nothing. Evelyn adjusted her spectacles once more. "The question is not whether murder was committed," she said, her voice hushed but firm. "The question, dear friends, is whether a murderer can sit among us, knowing their sins have come to light, and still believe they can escape." The grandfather clock chimed, the fire crackled, and somewhere just beyond the veil of silence, a single heartbeat quickened. A hushed stillness settled over the parlor, the warm glow of the fire at odds with the suffocating tension gripping the room. Miss Eleanor Gray, her fingers lightly resting on the delicate porcelain rim of her teacup, surveyed the gathering with a gaze both gentle and knowing. Across from her, Reginald Hawthorne, usually the picture of composed authority, sat rigidly, his jaw clenched just so, betraying an agitation he sought to suppress. Margaret Ellesmere, the grieving widow, had gone deathly pale, her fingers trembling as they tightened upon the handkerchief in her lap. The Langfords, mother and son, stood slightly apart, their wide eyes darting between Miss Gray and the accused, waiting for the inevitable unraveling. Miss Gray took a measured sip of her tea, then set it down with deliberate care. "It has been an exhausting affair," she murmured, her voice soft yet unwavering, "but I do believe we have reached the conclusion at last." She adjusted the silver chain of her spectacles before continuing, her tone conversational yet cutting. "A rather intricate deception, wasn't it? One requiring both intelligence and, I dare say, desperation." Her gaze flickered to Dr. Everett Linden, the renowned physician, whose normally unflappable demeanor now showed the faintest crack of unease. Mr. Ellesmere was a shrewd man, but careless in his trust. Miss Grey mused, her voice lilting like a storyteller spinning a cautionary tale. He invested heavily into your private practice, did he not, Dr. Linden? A promising venture, yet plagued with financial irregularities. Margaret let out a barely audible breath, as if hearing aloud a suspicion she had long harbored but feared to voice. Miss Grey folded her hands. The sums did not add up, and when Ellesmere, always a man of meticulous accounting, began asking pointed questions, what did he uncover? She let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the words to sink in. Dr. Linden's mouth pressed into a thin line, his hands tightening over the arms of his chair. A great deal of money had vanished, Miss Grey continued smoothly, and with it your reputation, your standing, your entire life's work was in peril. What then was to be done, Doctor? Linden inhaled sharply through his nose, but said nothing. You attempted reason first, no doubt. Perhaps you convinced him it was all a misunderstanding, a simple accounting error. But Mr. Ellesmere was not so easily swayed, was he? He continued pressing. And a man backed into a corner is often left with only one solution. Miss Grey's tone remained almost gentle as she delivered the final blow. You poisoned him. Margaret let out a strangled gasp. Dr. Linden's fingers twitched, but he remained otherwise motionless. A subtle method, Miss Grey went on. A gradual decline, attributed to natural causes, but of course a crime like this requires more than execution, it requires misdirection. She turned slightly, her gaze now resting upon Raymond Langford. He took an involuntary step back. Dr. Linden, she continued, you needed a scapegoat, someone upon whom suspicion would settle easily. A man with secrets, vulnerabilities, a past society would eagerly condemn. She looked towards Theodore Langford now, whose expression was a mask of disbelief. No offense, dear boy. Theodore swallowed hard. Miss Grey sighed. And so the evidence was planted. A bottle of Ellesmere's medicine, doctored with just enough of the lethal substance, conveniently found among Raymond Langford's possessions. A strangled cry escaped from Margaret, as she pressed a trembling hand to her lips. But of course, Miss Grey added, things unraveled, as they always do. Lies are a delicate construct, requiring constant reinforcement, and then there was Sergeant Morris. Theodore Langford let out a small choked sound. Miss Grey nodded in understanding. A man of small wit but considerable greed, she said. He did not know the full scope of what he was aiding, did he, Dr. Linden? Just enough to believe he was moving a piece in an elaborate game, and like all men who play without knowing the stakes, he overplayed his hand. He demanded more. Dr. Linden exhaled sharply, his patience fraying at the edges. And so, Miss Grey concluded, you silenced him. A slight adjustment to the brake line of his motor car, a seemingly tragic accident. The room held its collective breath. Dr. Linden stood suddenly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is ludicrous, he hissed. You sit here weaving stories like an old woman with nothing better to do. Miss Grey remained composed, watching him with the same quiet certainty. Across the room, Theodore Langford's face darkened with fury. You let them drag my father's name through the mud, he seethed. You let them believe he was a murderer. Raymond laid a steadying hand on his son's shoulder. It doesn't matter now, he said quietly. It's done. Linden let out a short, sharp laugh. You think this is over, he sneered. His eyes darted to Margaret. Tell me, my dear widow, how long did you intend to let me bear the blame alone? Margaret stiffened. Miss Grey's gaze never wavered from her. You knew, she said, not as a question, but a statement. Margaret's hands trembled. I didn't know it would go this far, she whispered. Ah, Miss Grey murmured, but you do not say you did not know. A sharp knock at the door shattered the thick silence. The inspector stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the room. settling at last upon the accused doctor. "I take it I won't need to ask any questions," he said dryly. Miss Gray gave him a small smile. "I rather think Dr. Linden has provided all the answers himself." Dr. Linden sagged, the defiance draining from him like air from a punctured balloon. He sank into his chair, rubbing his face with shaking hands. "It wasn't meant to happen like this," he murmured. "I only wanted to frighten him, make him back off." His voice was dull now, flat, but he threatened to go public. I knew what that would mean. His eyes lifted, resigned, to Miss Gray. It was easy, he admitted. A slight alteration to his dosage, something he would never notice. Margaret's lips parted, but no words came. Dr. Linden turned to the inspector. "You'll find your proof soon enough," he muttered. The inspector nodded to his men, and they stepped forward. As Dr. Linden was led away, Miss Gray watched, not with triumph, but with quiet understanding. Margaret remained seated, her face an unreadable mask. The inspector turned to her. "Did you have knowledge of any of this?" Margaret lifted her chin. "I knew nothing, and yet Miss Gray noted." Her hands still shook. The inspector hesitated, then sighed. "There is no evidence to charge you, Mrs. Ellesmere." Margaret nodded sharply. Miss Gray said nothing, for she understood the truth. Margaret had not committed the murder, but she had known and she had done nothing. The inspector turned to Theodore. "You are free to go, Mr. Langford." A choked sob escaped him as his father pulled him into a fierce embrace. For the first time in weeks, the weight had lifted. Miss Gray watched them, a quiet warmth settling in her chest. Justice, after all, was best served warm. As Miss Eleanor Graves took a delicate sip of her tea, a knowing smile flickered across her lips, a smile that only those who had spent their lives unraveling the tangled threads of truth could understand. The case was closed, justice had been served, and yet, like the finest embroidery, some stitches remained hidden, some truths left unspoken. A week had passed since the murder of Alistair Penrose and the downfall of Dr. Lionel Croft, and Westfield on the Green had on the surface returned to its usual rhythm. The milkman still made his morning rounds, the vicar still fretted over his beloved roses, and Mrs. Bellamy still found cause to quarrel with the fishmonger. But something had shifted, subtly yet unmistakably. Beneath the veneer of routine the village carried a lingering unease, an unspoken acknowledgement that trust, once fractured, was never quite the same again. Harriet Montague had returned to her father's shop, but the quiet ease with which she once moved had not returned with her. She was polite, composed, but there was a weight in her gaze, the kind borne by those who had stood too close to ruin. The villagers greeted her warmly now, some with a tinge of guilt for ever having doubted her. But Eleanor Graves, watching from her usual spot by the tea-room window, knew how villages worked. Scandals faded, but they were never truly forgotten. It was there, amid the gentle clinking of teacups and murmured conversations, that Mrs. Henrietta Bradshaw approached with her characteristic energy, setting down a fresh pot of tea with an air of ceremony. "Jane," she declared, her voice brimming with enthusiasm, "I dare say I've heard your name 100 times this past week. The inspector and the constable both agree, without you the case would have dragged on for months." Eleanor merely offered a faint smile, as though such praise was neither unexpected nor necessary. Mrs. Bradshaw leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "And Clarissa?" Eleanor set her cup down with careful precision. "She's leaving." Mrs. Bradshaw scoffed. "Not much left for her here, I suppose. She gets the estate, of course, and Alistair's fortune, but she's shutting up the manor for good." Eleanor wasn't surprised. Clarissa Penrose had not been charged with any crime. There was no evidence, no proof that she had played a part in her husband's death. And yet, Eleanor had seen something in her silence, not guilt, necessarily, but the absence of grief. The morning train released a soft hiss as it idled at the platform, steam curling around the edges like a whisper about to be lost in the wind. Eleanor stood at the platform's edge, her small suitcase resting beside her, her posture relaxed yet alert. It was always strange, leaving a place after a crime had been solved. Life resumed, but nothing ever quite returned to the way it had been. She thought of Dr. Croft, a man clever but not clever enough. Of Sergeant Parker, who had traded his honor for a price he hadn't lived long enough to spend. And of Clarissa Penrose, a woman who had gained exactly what she wanted, fortune and freedom. Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly around the handle of her handbag. Had Clarissa played an active role in her husband's demise, or had she simply seen which way the wind was blowing, and let fate take its course? That, Eleanor decided, was a question she would never have an answer to. A hurried set of footsteps behind her made her turn. Harriet Montague and her father, Edgar, had arrived at the platform, slightly out of breath. "Miss Graves," Harriet said softly, warmth in her voice. Edgar extended a small neatly wrapped package, a little something, he said hesitantly, to say thank you. Eleanor accepted it with a quiet nod, untying the brown paper with care. Inside was a finely stitched handkerchief, the initials EG embroidered in delicate blue thread. Harriet smiled shyly. "Just a small token." Eleanor ran her fingers lightly over the fabric. "My dear," she said gently, "it is perfect." Her gaze settled on Harriet, keen and knowing. "You have a bright future ahead of you. Suspicion once lifted makes room for possibilities." Harriet lowered her eyes for a moment, but there was something new in her expression, a quiet determination perhaps. Stepping onto the train, Eleanor turned once more to meet their eyes. "Be well," she said simply. The train gave a sharp whistle, and as it began to pull away, Eleanor settled into her seat, reaching into her handbag for her knitting. Her needles clicked softly, each stitch deliberate, measured. Justice, she thought, was never quite as neat as a well-made pattern. There were always loose threads, questions left unanswered, but sometimes justice was simply knowing the truth, even if the village chose to forget it. Eleanor Graves had done what she came to do, and now it was time to go home.